If you know Sun Tzu as the philosopher of war and think you've read The Art of War, you may have misunderstood the book. For most people, Sun Tzu is a name associated with battlefields, generals, and motivational quotes shared by entrepreneurs who've never actually read him. He is usually called the philosopher of victory. He's remembered as if he were a mysterious, mystical sage who decoded the psychology of conflict. But this narrative completely misses the real point. Because once you set aside the ornate words and legends, a much more interesting truth emerges. Sun Tzu was not obsessed with winning wars. He was obsessed with not fighting them. His concern was not glory, discipline, or dominating the enemy. His concern was the cost, the bill that would have to be paid after the war. And in a world that was exhausting itself through endless war, Sun Tzu was one of the first to say an uncomfortable truth this clearly. For a state, the greatest threat is not the enemy it faces. The greatest threat is the bill that arrives after the war ends. People think The Art of War is a book about fighting. In reality, at its core, this book is about money. Welcome to the Finance and Power channel. This is where money, power, and history are blended and presented to you. To understand Sun Tzu's financial intelligence, you first have to understand the world he lived in, because his ideas did not fall from the sky. They emerged from a world that was beginning to collapse under the weight of its own ambitions. In the 6th and 5th centuries BCE, China was filled with fragmented kingdoms. Each believed it could unify the world. Each strained its treasury to the last coin to do so. War had become continuous. Alliances were formed and dissolved again and again. Armies grew larger with every passing decade. Wars were no longer symbolic duels fought by nobles in chariots. They were massive infantry armies. And these armies demanded food, metal, roads, supply lines, and taxes. A burden that no society had ever been forced to carry before now existed. States were not just fighting wars, they were putting their economies through a mandatory stress test. The moment a king sent an army on campaign, he was effectively borrowing from the future. And most of the time, when the debt came due, he couldn't repay it. Today, we imagine ancient wars as heroic and strategic, but back then, war was above all else logistics. The moment an army moved, expenses began. Grain was needed, horses were needed, armorers, cooks, blacksmiths, porters were needed. A campaign lasting a few months could bankrupt a small state. A campaign lasting more than a year could drive even a large state toward collapse. Yet, the kingdoms were afraid. They were trapped in a cycle of insecurity and continued to fight anyway. A modern arms race, one that did not yet have a name, was unfolding, and the system was beginning to crack. Sun Tzu was born into this world, not as a quiet philosopher, but as someone trying to solve what looked like a military problem, but was actually an economic crisis. Today, we portray him as a romantic sage, but in reality, Sun Tzu was less a warrior and more a risk analyst. He could see the numbers, he could see the costs, he could see time, logistics, and exhaustion. And he realized this: if you fight like this, even if you win, you will go bankrupt. If the treasury collapses, victory has no meaning. But many rulers never understood this. They feared enemy armies. Sun Tzu feared his own expenses. That is why the most important sentence in The Art of War appears at the very beginning. War is a matter of vital importance to the state. Vital not because it is noble, vital because it is dangerous. Vital because if left uncontrolled, it can destroy the very state it is meant to protect. In the rest of the book, Sun Tzu does one thing only. He
He explains how to keep war short, controlled, and cheap. Even his famous quotes are misunderstood because of this. The supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting. This is not a philosophical aphorism, it is a pure cost calculation. When he says that prolonged wars benefit no one, he's not writing poetry, he's doing accounting. As war drags on, the state's ability to produce, collect, and survive erodes. That is why he emphasized speed, intelligence, psychology, and deception, because these are cheaper than armies. Sun Tzu's concern was not winning wars, it was preventing states from going bankrupt because of war. In ancient times, war was a matter of honor, but as populations grew and armies expanded, war became a budget problem. Sun Tzu saw that the old mindset now meant suicide. To him, every decision to go to war was in reality a bankruptcy risk. That is why the art of war is not an epic, it is a balance sheet. Even the 5 fundamental factors he describes are about resource management. When he explains the cost of feeding an army, there is nothing romantic about it. He explains how costs multiply as distance increases, and that the most destructive expense is not soldier pay, but transportation. One of Sun Tzu's clearest statements is this: logistics does not support strategy. Logistics is strategy. The same applies to his importance placed on intelligence. A single piece of information can prevent an army from marching in vain. A single spy can save a country from bankruptcy. What he called foreknowledge is what we today call data. Using information poorly is the same as spending money poorly. His emphasis on speed leads to the same conclusion. Speed reduces cost. Every passing day is money burning. Sun Tzu was not against war, he was against waste. And to him, the greatest waste was a war fought when it was not necessary. Rulers who love war bankrupt their own states. History has proven this many times. Prolonged wars brought internal collapse. Those who relied on intelligence, alliances, and speed survived. Even today, the pattern has not changed. Vietnam, Afghanistan, the First World War, these were not lost militarily, but economically. Sun Tzu's core lesson is this: states do not collapse because they lose wars. They collapse because they exhaust their capital. The best war is the one after which you don't have to rebuild the economy. The Art of War is not a book of courage. It is a book of moderation. Not a book of victory, but a book of stability. It is the philosophy not of warriors, but of stewards. Sun Tzu did not separate economics from power, and he left us with one disturbing truth. Power is measured not by how hard you strike, but how many strikes you can afford. History does not repeat itself exactly, but it makes us pay the same costs again and again. I strongly recommend that you read this book. And if this video gave you a new perspective, subscribe, because in the next video, I will tell you many fascinating things you don't know about history and money. Thank you for watching.